Hello. Let me begin by thanking you for asking me to offer a few brief remarks on this question. What are the main challenges facing educational systems nowadays? Now, I want to first point out this question as posed sort of invites comparison to previous days. The use of the word nowadays at the end of the question makes me think about what's changed in the last couple of decades. In many countries, we've had changing demographics. The students we're teaching have changed. There are changing expectations for student achievements in many systems. And of course, most notably, there are new technologies that both influence how we think about what students are doing outside of school hours, and then also invite us to think about how those technologies might be used inside of schools. But the truth is, I don't think any of those factors are the primary challenge facing school system nowadays. I think the primary challenge is the one that we have always faced. And I want to offer a particular point of view on what that challenge is. I think the greatest challenge of schooling is that people, and by people I really mean adults, the adults in the system, don't have very good insight into what they themselves know and know how to do. Now, on the one hand, this is a very obvious observation because any teacher will tell you this is the heart of being a good teacher, is understanding what the person in front of you who you're trying to teach, what it is they already know. And one of the great difficulties in understanding what a novice knows is the fact that you're no longer a novice. This is such a commonplace observation that it's earned a name. It's usually called the curse of knowledge, that once you become an expert, you can't really remember what it was like to be a beginner. And so it's hard for you to help the novice along on their path. So that's certainly true, and I think that's going to be persistent, but I'm actually, when I say people don't have insight into what they know, I'm talking about something a little bit more specific and something that is probably a little bit more addressable as we think about how to improve education. I'll offer a couple of examples of this. First, some of what we ask children to learn is not, in a sense, a natural thing for humans to learn. We're asking them to learn something that's kind of close to the way humans think, but is just a little bit off, and therefore that makes it difficult for children to acquire the concept. Psychologists have identified several aspects or several types of knowledge that fit this description in the last decade or two. We've got a couple of observations in reading. I'll offer one example from mathematics. In math, understanding that there's a whole lot of objects over here and many fewer over here, that's perfectly natural. And there's lots of good evidence that non-human animals appreciate that as well. But that understanding of numerosity is on a logarithmic scale. It really is sort of, that's a whole lot and that's not very many. And when you're doing that kind of comparison, the difference, for example, between 100 and 105 is, well, those two are basically the same, right? There's a whole lot over there and then there's a whole lot over here as well. But that difference of between 100 and 105 is, of course, the same as the difference between 5 and 10. And for a non-human animal and for a child who has not yet learned mathematics, the difference between 5 and 10 is a substantial difference, of course. I mean, it looks like, well, there was a whole lot more over there if there's 10 on this side and 5 on the other. Coming to that understanding that the difference between 10 and 5 is actually the same as the difference between 100 and 105 is not a natural concept to learn. And it takes some skillful teaching to get the child sort of over that hump of understanding. This is hard for adults to remember, the state of confusion they were in when they were first confronted with this problem. And that adds to the difficulty of helping children get over that hump of understanding. The second sense in which people don't have very good insight into what they themselves know is that when we're working to solve a problem or to critically analyze a claim or basically do any of the sort of high-level thinking that we really want our students to be able to do, we don't tend to notice how much our knowledge about the domain or the topic aids in our high-level cognition. So again, I'll offer just one example of how this plays out, in this case in reading comprehension. So suppose that you read these two sentences. Tricia spilled her coffee, Dan jumped up to get a rag. Now, if you were reading that, you would effortlessly not only understand the individual sentences, Tricia spilled coffee, Dan jumped up to get a rag, you would also effortlessly understand that there is a causal connection between those two sentences. Dan jumped up to get a rag because Tricia spilled her coffee. Now, what's interesting about this example is you'll notice the writer omitted a lot of information that you need. Not only did the writer not tell you, hey, there's a causal connection here. The writer just assumed you were going to make that causal connection. The writer also assumed that you had a lot of background knowledge that is needed in order to build that causal connection. You need to know that spilled coffee makes a mess. You need to know that people generally don't like messes. You also need to know that rags can clean a mess. This is a general characteristic of both oral communication and of written communication, that the communicator assumes a lot of knowledge on the part of their audience, and they're always trying to guess exactly what does my audience already know and what do I need to spell out. Now, when there's a mismatch, the reader, of course, is going to be confused. The writer was gambling that their audience would know something, and the reader doesn't know it. This is why background knowledge is an enormously important predictor of whether, broadly speaking, of a child or adult's success as a reader. People who have very broad knowledge tend to be very good readers of the sort that we usually try to prepare kids for. They're good readers of sort of general material written for general audiences. The thing to bear in mind about that, and the fact that adults tend not to notice, because adults who are in the education system tend to be adults who know a lot of stuff. They tend not to notice how much of their own success in education is due to the fact that they know a lot of stuff. They tend to not to appreciate how important it is that schools impart this knowledge. If schools fail to impart this knowledge, then we are counting on kids acquiring this knowledge elsewhere. And what's going to happen is we are going to exacerbate inequalities that are already in the system. In other words, kids who have a lot of opportunities to pick up knowledge outside of school are going to do that. They live in environments that are rich with those opportunities. Kids who come from poorer homes with fewer opportunities to learn that kind of knowledge, school is the main place that they're going to be able to learn it. And so if schools are not careful and systematic about making sure that everyone is getting the type of knowledge that's going to prepare them to be good readers, good problem solvers, creative thinkers, and so on, then we're going to see greater differences between wealthy and poor. So, to close on a positive note, I'm optimistic that this challenge can be met. The nature of the challenge is plain. When I say people don't have insight into what they know and can do, and I've described a couple of different ways this can play out. There's work for scientists to continue to identify ways in which this sort of knowledge is contributing to the type of cognition that we ask students to engage in school. There's work to be done by politicians. It takes a certain amount of courage at times to make change to educational policy. And of course, most of the work is to be done by educators. And they're already doing a great deal, as you all know, but they're in advocating for the solution to these problems. I think educators' voices are going to be the most important. But I do feel like if we all pull together, this is a problem that we can address. So thanks again for giving me a bit of your time today.